My son sent me a message on a Thursday morning in September that I read 3 times before I set the phone face down on the kitchen counter and stood at the window for a long time looking at the garden. The message said, "Papa, slight change of plans for October. Ingrid thinks the house in Corsica works better as just us this time. Her parents are coming. We thought it would be more relaxed without mixing everything. Hope you understand. We will plan something separate for you soon." I had paid for the house in Corsica. Not the trip to the house, not the food or the activities, but the house itself. The house had been purchased in my name through a company structure in 2017, rented through an agency for most of the year, and made available to Thomas and Ingrid every October as a family week, because October in Corsica has the specific quality of late Mediterranean autumn that I had always found to be the finest weather in Europe. Warm without the summer heat, the sea still swimmable, the tourists gone, the island returned to itself. It was a 2-week window I kept available each year, and that Thomas and Ingrid had been using for 3 years. In each of those 3 years I had been included for the first week and had driven back to Lyon at the end of it. This year the message arrived on a Thursday morning in September, and it said that Ingrid's parents were coming and that it would be more relaxed without mixing everything. Without mixing everything. I was the everything that would not be mixed. My name is Georges Reynard. I am 67 years old. I was born in Lyon in 1957, the son of a butcher and a seamstress, which is a combination of parents that produces in the children. It generates a specific relationship with the material world. The understanding that things are made and maintained by the specific application of skill and care, and that the made thing has a value that is proportional to the quality of what went into it. My father cut meat with the precision of someone who understood anatomy, and my mother assembled fabric into garments with the precision of someone who understood structure. And I grew up between these 2 disciplines, understanding that the quality of the result is always visible in the quality of the making. I studied law at the Université Lyon 3, and then civil law at the Université Paris 2 Panthéon-Assas, and I practiced for 6 years at a Paris firm before returning to Lyon in 1990 to join a regional practice that specialized in commercial property law. The property law career was one I had not anticipated when I began studying law, but that suited me precisely. Because property law at the commercial level is the discipline of understanding the relationship between things and the instruments that organize them. And this is a discipline I found to be a natural extension of what I had learned watching my father and mother work. The instruments must be sound, the structures must hold. I built the Lyon practice into one of the dominant commercial property law firms in the Rhône-Alpes region over 20 years, and I retired from active practice in 2018 at 61 years old, handing the firm to the 3 senior partners who had grown up in it and who were ready for its full weight. The retirement produced the specific condition that retirement produces in people who have organized their lives around work of substance, which is the condition of needing to find a different form for the substance, and I address this condition in the ways available to me, which were the management of the property portfolio that 20 years of careful professional income had assembled and the specific projects that the property portfolio made possible. The property portfolio. I should describe it briefly because it is relevant to everything that follows. It consisted at the time of the message from Thomas in September of 11 properties across France and 1 in Corsica. organized through 3 holding companies and managed with the assistance of a property management firm in Lyon and an accountant named Martine Gilles, who had handled my financial affairs for 15 years with the specific reliability of someone whose own professional standards are high enough to be trusted with the standards of someone else. The portfolio generated enough annual income to constitute financial independence for the remainder of my life and then some. I had not told Thomas the specific dimensions of this. I had told him I had investments and a property or two. He knew I was comfortable. He did not know the full architecture. I want to describe the architecture briefly, not to establish a financial position, but because the architecture was the result of 40 years of work, and because understanding what the work produced is necessary to understanding what the message in September meant in its full context. The first property was acquired in 1991. A small commercial unit in the Croix-Rousse district of Lyon that I had purchased with the combination of savings from 6 years of Paris practice and a bank loan at a rate that seemed high at the time and that became in retrospect the most intelligent financial decision I made in the first decade of my career. The commercial unit was rented to a small printing company for 11 years and then sold at a profit that constituted the seed capital for the next acquisition. The next acquisition was a residential building in Vieux-Lyon that needed renovation and that I renovated over 2 years with the careful supervision of a contractor I trusted and with the close engagement of my own professional knowledge about the instruments that organize the relationship between property and the people who inhabit it. From that second property, the portfolio grew through a sequence of carefully considered transactions over the following years, each of which was evaluated with the same rigor I had applied to the legal structures of other people's property transactions for 20 years. And that I found, when applied to my own, to be both more and less difficult than applying it to others. More difficult because the stakes were personal, less difficult because the knowledge was genuine. By 2010, there were 6 properties. By 2018, when I retired from active practice, there were 11 in France and 1 in Corsica. The French properties included the commercial unit I still owned in Croix-Rousse, renovated and rented to a graphic design studio, a residential building in Vieux-Lyon with 6 apartments, 2 houses in the Ardèche that I rented through a holiday let agency. A commercial property in Grenoble that I had acquired in 2009 at a price that reflected the financial crisis and that had appreciated significantly in the following decade, 3 apartments in Lyon in different districts, and 2 rural properties in the Drôme that I managed less intensively and that served as investments in land value rather than in rental income. The Corsica property was the most recent, the most beautiful, and the one that was no longer mine. The Corsica house was a property I had purchased in 2017 because it was a beautiful property in a region I loved, and because the numbers worked, and because I wanted a place on the island that was mine rather than rented. It sat above a small bay on the west coast, accessible by a track that required 4-wheel drive in wet weather, with a terrace that faced the sea and with the specific quality of silence that old stone houses in Corsica have when the shutters are open and the Mediterranean is visible between them. It was mine. I stood at the window of my Lyon apartment for approximately 20 minutes after reading the message. The garden below the window was doing what gardens do in September, preparing its transition with the specific unforced beauty of things that do not need to be told what season it is. I looked at it and I thought about Thomas. Thomas was 35 years old. He was a corporate lawyer at a firm in Lyon, the son of a property lawyer which is either a coincidence or a predictable consequence depending on how you interpret influence. He had been practicing for 8 years, and he was good at his work in the way that someone good at their work looks from the outside, which is the way of someone for whom the work is not a source of difficulty. He had married Ingrid 3 years ago. Ingrid was from Strasbourg, from a family with a specific relationship to Alsatian identity and the conventions that organized it, and she had the quality that certain women from certain French families have. The quality of knowing exactly how things should be done, and of finding other ways of doing them slightly embarrassing. I had noticed this quality in the first dinner we had together, and I had noted it without assigning it excessive significance, because noting it and finding it relevant are different things, and it had not yet become relevant. It was relevant now. The previous 3 years had provided a sequence of observations. The first year of the marriage, Thomas had been Thomas and Ingrid had been Ingrid, and the combination had been slightly formal, in the way that new marriages are sometimes formal when one family is unfamiliar to the other, and I had not found this alarming. The second year, the formality had become slightly settled, which is to say that it had become less a response to unfamiliarity and more a settled state, which is a different thing. The third year, which was this year, had provided 3 incidents that I had observed and filed as data points. I want to describe these 3 incidents in more detail than I gave in the account above, because the detail is what makes a data point meaningful, and without the detail, they are merely 3 abstract grievances of the kind that family life generates, and that can be rationalized away with sufficient goodwill. With the detail, they are something more specific. The first was the Sunday lunch in April with Ingrid's friend Elise. Elise had come to Lyon for a weekend, and Thomas and Ingrid had arranged a Sunday lunch at the apartment that included me, which I appreciated as a gesture. The lunch was good. Ingrid had cooked, which she did well, and the conversation moved between the various subjects of people who know each other in different ways. At some point, Elise asked about the apartment she had not visited before, and whether they had done much to it since moving in. Ingrid described the renovations they had made, the kitchen update, the new bathroom fixtures, the repainting of the main room. She said, "Thomas and I chose everything together which is right, and we have made the apartment our own." She said it 3 times in variations over the course of the lunch, the phrase "our apartment" and "Thomas's apartment," and "they had chosen" and "they had made," and in none of these descriptions was there any acknowledgement of the 30% contribution that I had made to the purchase price. This is not a contribution that demands public acknowledgement at every conversation. But 3 years into the apartment's life with me sitting at the table, the complete absence of any reference to it had a quality that was not accidental. The second was the birthday dinner in June. Thomas turned 35 on the 14th of June, and Ingrid organized a dinner for 12 people at the apartment, friends and colleagues of both of them and me. I arrived with the wine I have described. The 2009 Côte Rôtie from a producer named Jean-Michel Gérin, whose wines I had been following for 15 years and that I kept several cases of in the cellar, bringing 2 bottles from that cellar as a birthday contribution. Ingrid met me at the door, took the bottles, said how thoughtful, and set them on the sideboard with the specific gesture of someone who has made a decision about them and is executing it with the minimum of engagement. The wine that appeared with the dinner was a 2018 Côte de Rhône from a supermarket that retailed for approximately €9. I drank it without comment. It was adequate. The Côte Rôtie remained on the sideboard. Thomas opened his presents after dinner, and when he came to my envelope, which contained a card with a handwritten note about a dinner of his choosing at a restaurant I knew he liked, he read it, put it in his pocket, and did not mention it again that evening. This also was not in isolation significant. In the context of the cote rôtie on the sideboard, it formed a pattern. The third was the barbecue at Lucy's house in Villeurbanne in August. Lucy is Thomas's younger sister by 4 years, and she and her husband Fabien have a house with a garden in Villeurbanne that they use well and that produces in summer the specific event of a family barbecue that is one of the more reliable pleasures of French domestic life. Lucy had organized the afternoons, as she usually did, with the specific warm competence she had inherited from Colette, and that had always made family occasions easy rather than effortful. It was a good afternoon. Ingrid was pleasant and engaged, and contributed to the conversation in the way that she was capable of when she chose to. After lunch in the garden, Ingrid mentioned the kitchen renovation project that she and Thomas had been discussing, the plans to update the kitchen of the Lyon apartment. She described what they were thinking, the new materials, the new layout, the removal of the existing shelving. She described all of this as a settled plan rather than a discussion, as something that had been decided and was being shared, as information rather than as something that was being proposed for input. I noted that the shelves she described removing were the built-in shelves from 1994. I said nothing. Lucy noticed in the way that Lucy notices things and caught my eye briefly and then looked away. After the barbecue, driving home, I thought about the 3 data points. 3 observations over 3 years, each of which was in isolation, a small social friction, a discourtesy, an omission. Collectively, they described something more coherent, which was a relationship in which I was progressively being managed rather than included, in which my contributions were being treated as background infrastructure rather than as present gifts from a present person, and in which my son was participating through his silence in the same way that structures participate in their own failure through the absence of maintenance. The message on Thursday morning in September was the 4th data point, and it completed the pattern with a clarity that the previous 3 had lacked. 3 data points. I had been keeping them in the part of my mind that structural engineers and property lawyers both use for things that need to be accumulated before they can be assessed, the part where pattern recognition happens over time rather than in a single moment. The message on Thursday morning was the 4th data point, and it was the one that completed the pattern. I picked up the phone. I called Martine Gilles. Martine answered on the first ring. She is 62 years old, and she has been managing my financial affairs for 15 years with the reliability I described, and she has the quality that the best financial professionals have, which is the quality of understanding the situation they are managing comprehensively enough to recognize when a call is unusual and to respond to the unusual call without requiring explanation. She said, "Georges." I said, "Martine, I need to review the Corsica property structure." She said, "The Corsica property." I said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. She said, "Now." I said, "When you have an hour." She said, "I am free at 2. I was at her office at 2. I told her what had happened. She listened without expression, which is how Martine listens to everything. And when I had finished, she said, "What do you want to do?" I said, "I want to understand my options." She said, "The property is held in the holding company. You are the sole director. The holding company can terminate the arrangement at any time," I said. The arrangement for Thomas and Ingrid's October use. She said yes. The arrangement is informal, not contractual. It has never been formalized as a right. I said no. She said, then you can simply not make it available, or you can do something else. I said, what else is possible? She said, several things depending on what you want to achieve. She looked at me. She said, Georgie, what do you want to achieve? I held this for a moment. I said I want to achieve clarity. She said, clarity about what? I said, about what I am and what I am not. She said, and what are you? I said, I am the person who owns the things they are using. I said, I am apparently not a person whose presence is desired at those things. She said, those two situations are in tension. I said, yes. She said, and you would like to resolve the tension. I said I would like the relationship between those two facts to be transparent to everyone involved. She nodded slowly. She said, all right. She said, here is what is possible. We talked for 2 hours. By the time I left Martine's office, it was 4 o'clock, and the autumn light in Lyon was the autumn light that is specific to the city, the way it falls on the old stone of the buildings on the bank of the Rhone, and turns them the colour of something that has been accumulating warmth for centuries. I walked along the river for a while before getting my car. I thought about Colette. Colette had died 4 years ago. She was 60 years old, and she had been, for 33 years, the person who made my life make sense in the way that only a few people in any life make it make sense. She had been a teacher of French literature, which is a profession that produces a specific quality of attention to language and to the things that language reveals about what people actually mean. And she had brought this quality of attention to our marriage and to our raising of Thomas and to the relationships that constituted our life together. She had always known before I did when something was wrong with a human situation. She had the diagnostic capacity that structural analysis requires, but applied to people rather than buildings, the capacity to identify the failure before the failure is complete. She had not been certain about Ingrid. She had told me this in the second year of Thomas's relationship with her, in the specific, careful way she said things she was not certain were hers to say. She had said, I find it difficult to know what she thinks. I had said, she is from Strasbourg, different conventions. Colette had said, yes. She had said, it is possible that is what it is. She had not said more. She had died 8 months after Thomas and Ingrid's wedding, and she had not told me, in those final months, what she had concluded about Ingrid. I had thought since then that she had not concluded anything sufficiently certain to state. I thought about this walking along the Rhone in the September afternoon light. I thought she might have concluded something she chose not to say, because the conclusion would not have served any purpose she could foresee. I went home. I made dinner. I did not reply to Thomas's message. The following morning, Friday, I called my lawyer. Not Martine, who is an accountant, but my legal advisor, a man named Michel de Wael, who had been my professional colleague for 20 years before becoming my personal legal advisor when I retired. Michel is 65, and he is one of the finest property lawyers in France, and I trusted him absolutely. I told him the situation. He listened. He said, "What do you want?" I said the same thing I told Martine. Clarity. He said, "The same kinds of options apply." He said, "Do you want to talk through them?" I said yes. We talked through them over 2 days, Friday and the following Monday, in sessions at his office and in a long conversation on the phone Saturday morning. By Monday afternoon, I had a complete picture of what was possible and a decision about what to do. The decision was as follows. The Corsica property would be sold. Not to Thomas and Ingrid, who had no offer on the table and no right of purchase, but on the open market at market value. The sale process would begin immediately, and the October availability would be terminated. Thomas and Ingrid would receive the standard 30 days notice that the property was no longer available to them, which was 30 days more than the informal arrangement technically required. The Lyon apartment would be reviewed. Thomas's apartment had been purchased in 2019 with a contribution from me of 30% of the purchase price, structured as a loan with informal terms that had never been formalized in a contract because, at the time, the formalization had seemed unnecessary and slightly cold between a father and a son who trusted each other. The loan would now be formalized and a repayment schedule would be established. This was not punitive. This was what should have been done in 2019. My own financial and estate arrangements would be reviewed and formalized in a manner that reflected my current understanding of my situation and relationships. This review would involve Martine and Michelle together and would produce a documented structure that expressed clearly what was intended to go where and why. The review was long overdue, regardless of the message from Thomas. The message from Thomas was the occasion for addressing an overdue matter. I sent Thomas a message on Tuesday afternoon, 6 days after his message to me. The message said, "Thomas, I understand. I have been reviewing some property arrangements and will be in touch about a few practical matters in the coming weeks. I hope the October week is good for you and Ingrid. Georges." He replied in 12 minutes. He said, "Thanks, Papa. Everything okay with you?" I said, "Yes, perfectly well." He said, "Good. Speak soon." He did not ask what practical matters. He did not ask which property arrangements. He replied within 12 minutes and did not ask. The Corsica property went on the market in October. The agency priced it at the market rate for a property of its quality in that location, which was a number that would have constituted a significant surprise to anyone who had not been following the Corsican luxury property market and who had been thinking of the house in the informal way of something that was simply available rather than as the asset it actually was. The listing appeared on the agency website with photographs that showed the house, the terrace, the view of the sea, the stone interior. It was a beautiful house, and it sold in 43 days to a retired couple from Paris who had been looking for a West Coast property for 3 years. Thomas called me 3 days after the listing appeared. He said, "Papa." I said, "Thomas." He said, "There is a listing." He said, "The Corsica house." He said it as a statement rather than a question, which told me he was still processing what the statement meant. I said, "Yes, I put it on the market." He said, "Why?" I said, "I have been rationalizing the portfolio." He said, "The Corsica house." He said, "We use that house." I said, "Yes, you have used it for 3 years through an informal arrangement. The arrangement has ended." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Papa, this is because of my message in September." I said, "Thomas, the portfolio review is overdue, and I am addressing several matters simultaneously." The October situation was one signal among several that indicated I should review how my property arrangements serve my current situation and relationships. He said, "Several signals." He said, "What does that mean?" I said, "It means I have been paying attention." He was quiet for a longer moment. Then he said, "Can I come to see you?" I said, "Yes." He said, "Saturday." I said, "I will make lunch." He came on Saturday without Ingrid, which I had not specified, and which told me he understood that this was a conversation between us rather than a presentation for 3. He arrived at noon. I had made the lunch that I make when I want the food to be good without being theatrical, a simple roast chicken with herbs from the garden. and vegetables and a bottle of wine from the cellar. The kind of lunch that says, "I am glad you are here," without saying anything else. We sat at the table. We ate without discussing the main subject for the first part of the meal, which is how I prefer important conversations with food, establishing the space before the words. He talked about his work. I talked about a property review I was doing in the Drome. The chicken was good. The wine was the 2009 Côte Rôtie, which I had opened myself that morning and which was exactly as it should be. He looked at the wine. He said, "This is the one from June." I said, "Yes." He said, "I am sorry about that." I said, "Tell me what you are sorry about." He said, "Ingrid, she." He stopped. He said, "She had already chosen the wine and she did not want to." He stopped again. He said, "She was embarrassed that I had not told you not to bring wine." I said, "Was she embarrassed? Or did she not want the reminder that it was your birthday dinner and I was there?" He looked at me. He said, "Both probably." He said, "Papa." I said, "Yes." He said, "She is not easy." I said, "I know." He said, "Neither am I probably." I said, "No, you are not always easy, but you are mine and I am yours, and the being not easy is part of what that means." He nodded. He said, "The September message." I said, "Yes." He said, "That was Ingrid." I said, "Yes." He said, "She said it would be more relaxed." I said, "I know what she said." I said, "I also know that I paid for the house that was going to be more relaxed without me." He said, "I know." He said, "I should have told her that." I said, "Yes." He said, "I did not." I said, "No." He said, "I am sorry." I looked at my wine for a moment. I said, "Thomas, what I want to understand is not September specifically." I said, "I want to understand what September represents about the last 3 years." He was quiet. He said, "Tell me what you mean." I said, "I mean that September was the fourth in a sequence." He said, "What were the others?" I described the apartment, the birthday dinner, the barbecue, and the shelves. He listened with the expression of someone who is hearing a pattern described that they have lived inside and that becomes visible only when described from the outside. He said, "The shelves." He said, "She wanted them out." I said, "I know." He said, "They were old." I said, "They were made by your mother and me in 1994. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I know." He said, "I should have said something." I said, "What should you have said?" He said, "That they stay." He said, "That some things in the apartment are mine in a way that has nothing to do with her preferences." I said, "Yes." He said, "I did not say that." I said, "No." He said, "Why?" He was asking himself rather than me. I waited. He said, "Because it was easier not to." He said, "Because if I said it, I would have to have a conversation I did not want to have." I said, "And the September message was the same calculation." He said, "Yes." He said, "Everything is the same calculation." He said, "Papa." I said, "Yes." He said, "I think I have been making this calculation for 3 years, and I have been losing something with each calculation, and I did not notice until you sold the house." I said, "What have you been losing?" He said, "Myself, probably." He said, "And you?" I said. "Yes," I said, "and your mother's shelves." He almost smiled. He said, "Yes, and the shelves." We ate the rest of the lunch. The wine was very good. After lunch, we walked in the garden, the September garden, doing its patient transition, and we talked for 2 more hours about things that were not the immediate subject, but that were adjacent to it, about his work and my retirement, and about Colette and what she would have said about all of this. I said I thought she would have been specific. He said she was always specific. I said she would have told you precisely what she observed, and then she would have asked you what you were going to do about it. He said yes. He said she would not have waited 3 years. I said no. I said she was better at that kind of directness than I am. He said, you were direct enough. He said, the house on the market was very direct. I said, yes. It was the most efficient instrument. He left at 5. He shook my hand at the door, and then he put his arms around me, which he had not done since Colette's funeral, and the embrace had the quality of something that had been held back for a long time and was now available. I held it. I said nothing. He drove away. The Corsica sale completed in November. The proceeds went into the portfolio as a straightforward asset liquidation. The Lyon apartment loan was formalized in December with a standard repayment schedule that Michel drafted and that Thomas signed without objection. He signed it at the kitchen table of my Lyon apartment on a Sunday afternoon in December, while Ingrid was visiting her parents in Strasbourg, and after he signed it, he said, "This should have been done in 2019. I said, yes. He said, "Why wasn't it?" I said, "Because I trusted you and the formalization felt cold." He said, "And now?" I said, "And now the trust is still there and the formalization is appropriate." He said, "Both things at once." I said, "Yes, always both things at once." The estate and financial documentation review took until February. Martine and Michel worked on it together over 4 sessions and produced a structure that was clear and that expressed in the legal and financial language of such documents what I had decided about the organization of what I had built and where it should go. I read the final document, carefully made 2 amendments, and signed it. The document reflected what I believed, rather than what I had assumed others would expect, which is what such documents should reflect, and what mine had not previously reflected with sufficient precision. I want to describe what the document contained, not in its full technical detail, but in its broad intention, because the broad intention is the part that matters for this account. The 11 French properties and the portfolio they constituted would remain under my management for the duration of my life, organized through the existing holding company structures, with Martine continuing in her role. On my death, the properties would not pass automatically to Thomas through the intestate mechanisms that would otherwise apply, but would instead be distributed according to a specific set of instructions that reflected my considered understanding of what each element of the portfolio should do and for whom. A significant portion of the portfolio's eventual value was directed toward a foundation, the specifics of which Martine and Michel were developing, and which would support legal education for students from financially limited backgrounds, which is the cause most directly connected to what I had spent my professional life doing, and to what I believed most directly served the public rather than the private interest. Thomas's share of the estate was preserved and was substantial, but it was specified rather than assumed, and the specification reflected my current understanding of the relationship rather than the relationship I had imagined before September. I told Thomas about the document in March at a lunch that was again just the 2 of us at a restaurant on the Presqu'île that we had been going to since he was a student, and that still made the same pike quenelles that we had been eating there for 20 years, and that were in the opinion of both of us perfect. I told him what the document contained in the terms I have described above. He listened carefully. He did not look alarmed or wounded or defensive. He looked like someone who is receiving information that they had partially anticipated and that they find, on hearing it, fair. He said, "The foundation." I said, "Yes." He said, "Maman would have liked that." I said, "I think so." He said, "It is good." He said, "Papa, about the estate structure." He said, "I want to ask you something directly." I said, "Please." He said, "Is this a message to me?" I said, "Yes." I said, "It is a message that what I build matters and that I have been specific about where it goes and why." I said, It is also a message that the where and the why are not fixed permanently, but reflect my understanding at the time of writing, and that my understanding is responsive to the quality of the relationship. He said, "You are saying you can change it." I said, "I am saying I always review it." He said, "Fair enough." He said, "I think that is fair." I said, "Good." He said, "Ingrid." He said it as a word that was itself a question. I said, "Yes." He said, "We have had some conversations since October." I said, "I assumed you had." He said, "She is not entirely." He stopped. He said, "She understands now why the house was sold and what it meant. She does not fully understand why I find this acceptable, and she had expected me to be angrier at you," I said. "And you are not angry?" He said, "No." He said, "I think you were right." He said, "I think the things you described at the October lunch, the sequence of events, I think you were right about what they represented." He said, "I have been trying to figure out how to be more present in my own life." I said, "That is a worthwhile project." He said, "I know." He said, "Ingrid does not fully agree that the project is necessary." I said, "I see." He said, "We are in discussion." I said, "Good." I said, "That is the right place to be." He said, "Yes." He said, "Papa." I said, "Yes." He said, "The shelves." I said, "Yes." He said, "I put them back." I looked at him. He said, "She was not happy about it." I said, "No." He said, "But they are back." He said, "They belong there." I said, "Yes, they do." We ate the pike quenelles. They were as they always were, which is to say perfect, the specific perfection of something that has been made correctly for a long time by people who know what correctly means and who have not looked for a more interesting version. I thought about my father cutting meat. I thought about my mother cutting fabric. I thought about Colette. I thought about the message in September and the months that followed it and the document in February and the lunch in March and the shells that were back on the wall of the apartment on the Rue Mercière where Thomas lived, with the marks my wife and I had made on them in 1994 when we assembled them together in an afternoon that was entirely ordinary and that I remembered with the specific clarity of ordinary afternoons that turn out to have mattered. I am sitting in the garden of the Lyon apartment on a June evening. The garden is in its June state, which is its best state, the roses that I planted along the south wall, doing what they do in June, which is to be completely involved in the specific business of being roses in June without any modification for the opinions of people watching them. The light on the city in the evening is the light that I have been looking at for 67 years, and that I continue to find worth looking at the warm, specific light of Lyon on the stone and the river and the old buildings that have been standing since before anyone currently alive was born, and that will be standing after all of us are gone. Thomas called last week. He and Ingrid are looking at a house outside Lyon in the hills above the city with land and a garden. He wanted my professional opinion on the structure of the purchase and whether the land value was fairly reflected in the asking price. I told him what I knew about the market in that part of the Mons du Lyonnais, and we talked for an hour about the specific legal structure of rural property acquisition in France, and about what due diligence was appropriate, and about what questions he should be asking the agent. It was a professional conversation of the kind I used to have with clients for 40 years, and that I have not had in the years since I retired, because the opportunities have been fewer, and Thomas has not often thought to ask. He said at the end of the call, "This is useful." He said, "I forget that you know all of this." I said, "You have not always thought to ask." He said, "No." He said, "I am going to try to think to ask more." I said, "Good." I said, "I am glad to be asked." I am sitting in the garden in the June evening, and I am thinking about what I would tell someone who wanted to understand what happened between September and June, the 9 months of this account. I would tell them the following. A message arrived that said I was not wanted at the thing I was paying for. I did not reply with anger, because anger would not have clarified anything that was not already clear to me. I did not make threats, because I do not make threats, which is a quality of professional life that transfers to personal life with the same reliability. I did what I have always done with situations that require a response. I assessed the structure. I identified the load-bearing elements and which of them were compromised. I made decisions about which compromised elements required immediate action and which required monitoring. I implemented the decisions in the correct sequence. I communicated clearly when communication was possible and useful. The house was sold because it was my house, and because the arrangement through which Thomas and Ingrid were using it did not reflect the actual nature of the relationship. The loan was formalized because it should have been formalized in 2019, and because the formalization expressed accurately what the relationship between a property and its financing actually is. The estate documents were revised because they should have been revised earlier, and because revising them produced a structure that reflected my actual intentions rather than my assumed ones. Thomas put the shelves back. He did it on his own, which I did not ask him to do, and which I did not know he had done until he told me in March. The shelves are back on the wall of the apartment with the marks from 1994 visible on them, and they will be there when I next visit, which is Sunday. And I will look at them, and I will think about Colette, and about the ordinary afternoon we assembled them, and I will be glad they are there. The message in September said I was not family. The message was wrong. It was wrong because family is not determined by invitation. Family is determined by presence over time and by the specific kind of care that persists even when it is not convenient, and even when the convenient thing would be to let the relationship reduce to its minimum functional requirements. I have been present over time. I have provided the specific care that persists. These things are true regardless of who is invited to the house in Corsica in October. The house in Corsica is someone else's now. I hope they find it as beautiful as I did. I hope they sit on the terrace in the morning with the shutters open and look at the sea and understand that they are in one of the finest places in Europe at one of the finest times of year to be there. I hope they stay for a long time. My name is Georges Reynard. I am 67 years old. I was born in Lyon, the son of a butcher and a seamstress, and I grew up understanding that the quality of the result is always visible in the quality of the making. I have been making things for 67 years, a legal career, a property portfolio, a marriage with Colette, a son named Thomas, and the specific accumulated structure of a life that has tried to be built correctly from the foundation up. The foundation is sound. I have reviewed it, and I know it is sound. Everything above it can be addressed one element at a time in the correct sequence with the appropriate instruments. That is what I have been doing. That is what I intend to continue doing. The garden is very fine this evening. The roses have been waiting all year for June, and they are making the most of it. I am going to sit here for a while and let them. I want to describe more fully what happened in the 2 months between my conversation with Martine and Michelle and the Saturday when Thomas came to lunch, because those 2 months were not simply the period of waiting for the outcome to develop, but a period in which I was living inside what I had decided and understanding it more clearly as I lived in it. The Corsica listing appeared in October. The October that had been designated for Thomas and Ingrid and her parents passed without the house being used by them because the house was on the market and therefore not available through the informal arrangement that had been the basis of its use. Thomas did not call about this for the first 2 weeks. I assumed he was in contact with the rental agency and had discovered the situation through that channel. When he called on the 3rd week, it was with the tone of someone who has been thinking about what to say and has settled on directness, which I appreciated. In the meantime, I had been living my own October, which was a better October than I had expected. I drove to the Ardèche to check on one of the properties there and spent 2 nights in the village where it stood and walked in the hills and ate the local food and drank the local wine, which is not famous wine and which is exactly what it is, and that I found entirely satisfying. I drove back through the Drôme and stopped at the 2 rural properties there and walked the land of each of them in the October light that is specific to the Drôme. The autumn light of southern Provence pressing north, warm and clear, and with the specific quality of altitude that gives the light there its transparency. I had not been to these properties in 2 years. The last visit had been in the autumn before Colette died, a trip we had made together, the 2 of us, to the rural properties that she had never found entirely practical as investments, but that she had loved as landscapes. She had walked the land of the Drôme properties with the specific quality of pleasure she brought to outdoor places. The pleasure of someone for whom the material world was a source of genuine interest rather than an aesthetic backdrop, and she had said, standing on the edge of the upper field of the larger property, looking south toward the hills, "This is the one that is not an investment." I had said, "It does not perform well relative to the others." She had said no. She had said, "Keep it anyway." I had said, yes, I had kept it. I stood on the edge of the upper field in October, and I thought about Colette. I thought about the quality of her attention to things and to people, and about how much of what I had understood about what was happening with Thomas and Ingrid had been understood through the filter of what she had told me she had observed and what she had not told me but had implied, and what I had been able to reconstruct from the gap between the two. I thought about whether she would approve of what I had done. I thought she would have done it differently, more directly and more quickly, without the 6 days of silence before the text message, without the managed quality of the response. She would have called Thomas. She would have said, "I received your message and I want to talk about it." She would have had the conversation immediately rather than through structural realignment. She would have been right, and the structural realignment would not have been necessary because the conversation would have addressed the situation before it required structural intervention. But I am not Colette, and I have never had her specific gift for the direct human conversation that clears the air. I have always worked through structures, which is to say, through the instruments that organize relationships between things, and the structures I built in October and November and December and February were my version of what her conversation would have been. They produced, I think, an outcome that was not entirely different from what her conversation would have produced, which was Thomas putting the shelves back on the wall. The path was different. The destination was similar. I do not know whether this is consoling or merely interesting. Perhaps it is both. The sale of the Corsica property completed in November, as I have described. I received the proceeds and reinvested them through Martine into a diversified position that did not include another holiday property. I did not feel the loss of the Corsica house as acutely as I had expected to feel it. The house had been beautiful, and I had enjoyed it, and I would have enjoyed many more Octobers in it if the circumstances had developed differently. But the circumstances did not develop differently, and the house has another owner now, and I have other things. The feelings about the house resolved into the specific mild grief that is appropriate to the loss of a beautiful place rather than the sharper grief that attaches to the loss of something irreplaceable. What I did feel, with a quality that I had not expected, was a specific freedom. The Corsica house had been, for 3 years, the site of something that I had been managing rather than enjoying. The October weeks had been pleasant weeks, and I had valued them, but they had also had the quality of occasions I was attending rather than occasions I was part of. And the difference between those two qualities is the difference between being present and being tolerated. When the house was sold, I was no longer the host of an occasion that managed my presence. I was simply a man with money in the bank from an asset sale. This is a small distinction and a large one simultaneously. There is one more thing I need to tell you, which is about Lucy. Lucy had seen the Corsica listing before Thomas called me. She called me the day after it appeared on a weekday morning when she knew Thomas would be at work. And she said, "Papa." I said, "Lucy." She said, "The Corsica house." I said, "Yes." She said, "You sold it." I said, "I listed it." She said, "You are going to sell it." I said, "Yes, I expect so." She said, "Good." There was a pause. She said, "Tease. I have been waiting for something to happen." I said, "Tell me what you mean." She said, "I mean that I have been watching for 3 years, and I have been worried, and I have not known what to do." I said, "What have you been watching?" She said, "Ingrid, mostly." She said, "Thomas through Ingrid." She said, "The way things were going in the apartment." She said, "The lunch in April with Elise." She said, "The birthday dinner." She said, "The barbecue." I said, "You notice those things." She said, "Papa, I am my mother's daughter." I said, "Yes." She said, "I notice things." She said, "What I did not know was whether you noticed them." I said, "I noticed them." She said, "And now you are doing something." I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She said, "It needed to happen." She said, "He needed something to happen." I said, "Lucy." She said, "Yes." I said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "Yes." I said, "Was there anything else? Anything you saw that you have not mentioned?" She was quiet for a moment. She said, "The shelves." I said, "Yes." She said she told him in June that she wanted them out. He told her the shelves were from Maman and that she would need to wait. She said she told him they were old and there were better options. She said he waited 2 months and then he told her he would have them replaced. I said, "Replaced?" She said yes. He had already arranged for new shelves to be made. He had not told you. She said the new shelves were going to be installed in November. She said, "I found out in September, the week before your message from him." I said, "I see." She said, "Papa." I said, "Yes." She said, "Do not be too angry with him." She said, "I think he was trying to keep the peace." I said, "I know." She said, "He is not good at seeing the difference between keeping the peace and losing himself." I said, "No." I said, "He is not." I sat with this for a moment. The shelves that Thomas had planned to replace in November were back on the wall in March because he had put them back himself after our October lunch. The replacement had not happened. The plan had been cancelled at some point between October and March, which meant Thomas had made the decision, whether from the lunch or from some other moment of clarity that I was not present for. The shelves were back. He had done it on his own. I said, "Lucy, the shelves are back." She said, "I know." She said, "He told me." She said he came to our house in November before the Corsica sale completed, and he had dinner with Fabian and me, and he told us he had put the shelves back. She said, "He said they belong there." She said, "He seemed." She stopped. She said, "He seemed different." I said, "Different how?" She said, "More present," she said, like something had been resolved. She said, "He said he had been having conversations with Ingrid about what he wanted his life to look like, and that they were difficult conversations but necessary ones. I said, "Good." She said, "Yes." She said, "Papa?" I said, "Yes." She said, "You did the right thing." I said, "I hope so." She said, "You did not do it for the right reasons exactly." She said it carefully. I said, "Tell me what you mean." She said, "I think you did it because you were hurt." I said, "Yes." She said, "And also because it was right to do." I said, "Yes." She said, "Both things." I said, "Yes, both things." She said, "Maman would say that is honest." I said, "Yes, she would." She said, "I miss her." I said, "So do I." She said, "Every day?" I said, "Every day." We talked for another 40 minutes about other things, the ordinary conversation of a father and a daughter who find each other's company easy and who do not need a subject to make the conversation worth having. She asked about the drone properties and whether I would ever sell them. I said I did not think so. She said, "The upper field." I said, "Yes." She said, "I remember that field." I said, "You were 12. She said, "Maman showed me the view from the top." She said it was the view you would keep. I said, "Yes." She said, "Keep it." I said, "I intend to." I want to describe one last thing, which is a dinner in May. Thomas and Ingrid came to my apartment for dinner in May, both of them, the first time Ingrid had been to my apartment since the previous January. I had prepared the dinner with the same attention I bring to property documents, which is the attention of someone who wants the result to be correct and who believes the result is always visible in the preparation. The dinner was good. It was a substantial dinner for 3 people. The food of the region done well, a breast chicken with morels and cream that I had been making for 30 years, and that Colette had always said was the definitive version, and that I believed was not quite the definitive version, but was good. Ingrid was at the dinner different from the Ingrid of the previous 3 years in a way that I noticed and that I had not expected. She was not warmer exactly, or rather she was warmer, but the warmth had a different quality from the social warmth she had deployed at previous occasions. The quality was the warmth of someone who has been having difficult conversations with their husband about who they are and who they want to be, and who has arrived at some provisional conclusions and is offering those conclusions tentatively through the specific medium of a dinner in a father-in-law's apartment. It was not a performance, it was an attempt. She said at one point in the dinner, while we were discussing the kitchen renovation she had been planning, that she had decided to leave the kitchen as it was for the time being. She said the apartment had a character and she did not want to disrupt it unnecessarily. Thomas looked at his plate. She said, "The shelves are from Thomas's mother. I know that." She said, "They belong there." She said it simply, without the specific self-consciousness of someone who is performing a concession. She said it as a statement of fact that she had arrived at and that she was sharing. I said, "Yes, they do." That was all that was said. We continued the dinner. The chicken with morels was good. The wine was good. The apartment had the quality it has in May evenings, when the light through the windows is the May light of Lyon, and the garden below is doing what the garden does in May, and everything is in its correct season. After dinner, when Thomas was in the kitchen making coffee, Ingrid and I were briefly alone. She said, "Monsieur Renard." I said, "Ingrid." She said, "I owe you an apology." She said it directly and without preface. I said, "Tell me what you are apologizing for." She said, "For September, for the way the message was written." She said, "I wrote the message." She said, "I told Thomas what to write." She said, "I wrote it the way I would want to receive such a message, and I did not think about what it meant to send it to you specifically." I said, "What did it mean?" She said it meant that the person who owned the house we were using was being excluded from the use of his own house. She said I did not frame it that way when I suggested it. I said no. She said I understand it now. I said, how did you come to understand it? She said Thomas explained some things. She said, and I thought about how my own father would feel if he were in your position. She said he would feel as you felt. I said, and how did I feel? She said, as if you were furniture. She said it plainly. I said, yes, that is close to accurate. She said, I am sorry. I said, I appreciate you telling me. I said, Ingrid. She said, yes. I said, there is something I want to say to you as well. She waited. I said, I am aware that entering a family is not a simple thing. I said, the existing relationships have a weight and a history and an architecture that was built before you arrived, and that does not automatically accommodate new people. I said, I have not always made this easy. She said, you have always been. She stopped. She said, you have been present. She said, that is not always easy to be present around. I said, no. I said, I know that. She said, I think I was dealing with your presence by making you less present. I said, yes. I said, I noticed. She almost smiled. She said, yes. She said, I understand now that you notice everything. I said, it is a professional habit. She said, yes. Thomas told me. Thomas came back with the coffee. We drank it. We talked for another hour. At 9 o'clock they left. Thomas shook my hand at the door and then embraced me, as he had at the October lunch. Ingrid kissed me on both cheeks, the formal French greeting she had always deployed, and that felt this time slightly less formal than before. I closed the door. I went to the kitchen and washed the 3 coffee cups. I stood at the kitchen window and looked at the garden in the May evening. Everything was in its correct season. I want to add one thing about the legal career that I did not include in the introduction, but that is relevant to understanding how I approached the 9 months of this account. In 40 years of practicing and then teaching property law, I worked with hundreds of families in the specific situations that property law creates when families are in transition, deaths, divorces, inheritance, disputes, the renegotiation of financial arrangements between parents and children, between siblings, between former partners. I saw all of these from the legal side, which is the side that comes into play when the human relationships have already produced a situation that requires the instruments of law to address. What I observed consistently over 40 years of this work is the following. The situations that required legal intervention were almost always situations in which the informal arrangements that preceded the legal intervention had been allowed to develop for too long without being examined. A parent who contributed financially to a child's property purchase without formalizing the contribution would, 10 years later, be in a dispute with the child's former spouse about what the contribution had been and what rights it conferred. A family that managed a property portfolio through informal convention rather than documented structure would, at the moment of the first death in the family, discover that the informal convention had been understood differently by different family members and that the different understandings had produced conflicting expectations. The formalization that had seemed cold at the time of the arrangement's creation would have prevented the dispute that required legal resolution 10 years later. I knew all of this. I had known it for 40 years. And I had allowed the arrangements with Thomas to remain informal because the formalization had seemed cold, and because I trusted him, and because the question of what trust requires and what trust excuses is one that property law does not fully answer. Property law answers the question of what happens when trust fails. It does not answer the question of whether trust will fail. When I formalized the arrangements in December and February, I was doing what I had advised clients to do for 40 years. I was doing it late, which I acknowledged to Thomas at the December lunch when he said it should have been done in 2019. He was right that it should have been done in 2019. The fact that it was done in 2019 as an informal arrangement and formalized 4 years later does not make the formalization wrong. It makes it overdue. Overdue and wrong are different conditions. I addressed the overdue condition when I addressed it. This is also, I think, true of the broader situation. I allowed the informal arrangement of my relationship with Thomas and Ingrid to develop without examination for 3 years, and the development produced by September a situation that required the structural equivalent of formalization. The sale of the Corsica house was the formalization, it said, in the language that property transactions speak, which is a clear and unambiguous language. This is what the relationship between this property and the people who use it actually is. It clarified what the informal arrangement had obscured. Clarity is not punishment. It can feel like punishment to people who preferred the obscurity. But the preference for obscurity is itself information about the relationship. Thomas and Ingrid had preferred, through the informality, to not have to acknowledge certain things about the financial structure of their lives and what it required and from whom. The formalization required the acknowledgement. The acknowledgement was uncomfortable. The discomfort was appropriate. I have been a property lawyer for long enough to know that the property is never entirely about the property. The property is always partly about what the property represents in the relationship between the people who own it and use it and depend on it. The Corsica house represented something about the relationship between Georges Renard and his son's wife. And the sale of the Corsica house was a statement about that relationship in the language that the relationship had been avoiding in its preferred language of social exchange. I am fluent in several languages. Property law is one of them. This is perhaps more than anyone needed to know about my professional formation and how it influenced a personal situation. But I have found in the months since September that the professional formation and the personal situation were not as separable as I had always assumed them to be. I had spent 40 years becoming a specific kind of person. The kind of person who understands the relationship between things and the instruments that organize them. I brought that person to a family situation that required exactly that understanding. The understanding was available and I used it. That seems in retrospect to be what the years were for. There is a final thing I want to tell you, which is about Sunday. Thomas and Ingrid are coming to Sunday lunch this week. Thomas called to arrange it. He said he and Ingrid wanted to see me and that Ingrid wanted to ask me about the property acquisition they were considering in the hills above Lyon and to get my professional opinion. I said I would make lunch. He said, "Something good?" I said, "Yes. I am going to make the breast chicken with morels again. It is the right season for morels, and I have a sauce for them that is reliable and that produces the specific quality of morel that the dish requires, which is the quality of a morel that has been properly dried and reconstituted, rather than the fresh morel that is available earlier in the season and that does not have the same depth. The chicken will be the specific Bresser chicken that has been the foundation of this dish for 30 years, raised in the way that Bresser chickens are raised, and that produces the specific quality of the meat that makes the dish what it is. I will open a bottle from the cellar, the right bottle for a Sunday in June with family, which is to say, a bottle that is good enough to honor the occasion and not so precious as to burden it. I will set the table in the way that Colette set it with the specific attention to the arrangement of the elements that she had not formal, but considered each thing in the right place for the right reason. The shelves will be visible through the open door of the sitting room if we are at the kitchen table, which we will be because the kitchen table is where we eat when we eat together. The marks from 1994 will be visible to anyone who knows to look for them, and invisible to anyone who does not. This is appropriate. Sunday is 3 days away. The garden is in June and the roses are doing their specific best. The city is doing what Lyon does in June, which is to be entirely itself in the specific quality of the summer light that falls on it from the south and that gives it its colour and its warmth and its character as a city that has been in this place since the Romans and that has no intention of being anywhere else. My name is Georges Renard. I am 67 years old. I was born the son of a butcher and a seamstress who made things with their hands and with their specific skills, and who understood that the quality of the result is always visible in the quality of the making. I have been making things for 67 years. I am still at it. Sunday is 3 days away. I am going to make something good. The morels are soaking in warm water on the counter as I write this. The chicken is in the refrigerator. The wine is in the cellar. Everything is in its correct place for the occasion it is preparing for. That is enough. That is the full account. One more thing. The upper field in the Drome. I drove there again last month in May, the day after the dinner with Thomas and Ingrid. I drove down on a Thursday morning and spent 2 nights in the village and walked to the land on both days. The field was doing what fields in the Drome do in May, which is to be in the process of becoming its summer self, the wild grass coming up through the remains of last year's growth. The specific wild flowers of the limestone plateau beginning in the southern corners where the sun reaches first. The view from the top of the upper field to the south was what it always is, the hills going back in layers to the horizon, and the sky above them the specific deep blue of the south of France in May. Colette had stood here and said, "This is the one that is not an investment." I had said it did not perform well. She had said, "Keep it anyway." I am going to keep it. I am going to keep it because she asked me to, and because she was right, and because the things that are not investments are sometimes the most important things, and because the field in May with the wildflowers coming up in the southern corners is worth keeping regardless of what it returns per square metre per year. This is a property lawyer saying this. I know what I am saying. I am saying it anyway. Keep the things worth keeping. That is the legal advice and the life advice simultaneously. They are the same advice. They have always been the same advice. Georges Renard, Lyon, June. Bonne semaine. The garden is fine. The roses are fine. Thomas is coming Sunday, and Ingrid is coming Sunday, and I am going to make something good. That is the situation, and the situation is good. There is one thing more I want to note, which is about the message I sent Thomas in reply to his September text. The message that said, "Thomas, I understand. Slight change of plans for the portfolio. We'll be in touch about practical matters. I hope the October week goes well." I have thought about that message many times in the month since. It was the most precisely calibrated communication I had sent in many years, calibrated to say something real without saying more than was necessary, calibrated to express understanding without expressing acceptance, to express intention without expressing threat. In 40 years of legal practice, I had written many such communications. The skill of the communication is in the gap between what it says and what it does not say, And what this message did not say was everything that subsequently happened, including the Corsica listing and the loan formalization and the estate documents and the October in the Droma loan, looking at the property portfolio. And what it said was only, "I understand and I am attending to my affairs." Thomas had replied within 12 minutes and had not asked what I meant. This told me that he understood the gap between what I said and what I did not say, or that he chose not to ask, which is perhaps the same thing. He knew me well enough to know that when I said I was attending to practical matters, I meant something by it, and that asking what I meant would produce an answer he was not ready to receive on a Thursday morning in September. He was right. He was not ready on Thursday. He was ready on the Saturday in October when he came alone to lunch with the 2009 Côte Rôtie on the table and the Morel chicken in the oven and the garden in the September light and the knowledge that the Corsica listing was visible to anyone who looked. He was ready then. The gap between the Thursday and the Saturday was the gap in which he became ready, and the work I did in that gap was the work that made the Saturday possible. This is property law and human relationship simultaneously. Both disciplines involve creating the conditions in which a clear transaction can occur. The conditions take time to develop. The development cannot be rushed without losing something essential. You wait for the conditions and then you act when the conditions are present. The conditions were present on the Saturday in October. The morels on the counter are soaking. The chicken is in the refrigerator. Sunday is coming and the situation is good. Georges Renard, Lyon, June.